Hi, we're talking about Victorian literature this week, and very specifically just about two Victorian poets and one Victorian prose writer, and that from a period of enormous literary output. So you should understand this is a very, very limited sketch. Robert Browning and Alfred Lord Tennyson are the poets we're looking at, and Robert Louis Stevenson is the prose writer. We're looking specifically at dramatic monologue as a literary genre for Browning and Tennyson. And for all three, we're looking at questions of Victorian identity and the duality of the individual psyche, really in all three, but most specifically in Stevenson. So just a brief review, and let me emphasize how important it is that you look at the materials and read the Norton this week, because this period is so big and there's so much happening that I want you to try to get as much of a grasp of it as you can, sort of historically. Some of the key things that I want to touch on are about the growth, because if you can get a sense of how the people of this period felt, I think you get a better sense of what we're seeing in the literature. So the period is marked by the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, a very long reign. And during that long rule, England went through enormous and dramatic changes, perhaps the most dramatic in modern history. The population of London, for example, went from 2 million when she took the throne in 1837 to 6.5 million in 1901. The number of British subjects globally by the year 1890 was 1 in 4 people. 1 in 4. Clearly, the British Empire was a reigning power in the world at that point. And of course, there were vast changes in industrial and imperial power. With this wealth, power, and imperialism came some strong influences on literature. For example, a widely educated public, really, most citizens could read, influenced the massive outpouring of literature. With periodical publication, the novel became the dominant form. So you know that Charles Dickens, for example, published his works in periodicals. So there might be 2 chapters of Oliver in 1 week and then 2 to come in the next in the periodical publications. And these novels, whether they were novels of fact or not, sought to represent a broad social world. It included races, classes, and varying political views. And this form then influenced poetry in that the authors of poetry sought to convey stories through verse more than ever before. And this is where the dramatic monologue that we're going to be looking at comes in. What also came with the rise of the English Empire and the long reign of one monarch were certain cultural values or assumptions that are present in the literature. So, for example, literature is seen as serving a moral or moralizing purpose, and this is very clear in all of the literature. The key concepts that drive the era, for example, expansion of empire, glorification of war, economic progress, these are all promoted in the literature by the authors out of their sense of moral obligation to advance these values. Victorian literature also reflects the despair and alienation that many artists felt in this period, even as they served as moral arbiters. So, for example, Alfred Lord Tennyson, who you'll read about, was very melancholic and very, they did feel a sense of isolation. And you see this in his work, even though he was the poet laureate for the Queen and beloved and felt strongly his duty to uphold her values and promote them. So there was at once a mood of melancholy and a celebration of the glories of British Empire throughout the literature of this period, not just in Tennyson. And as the period wanes, we see more and more decay, corruption, and moral ambiguity. And so you see this in Stevens's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but also with the aesthetic movement of Oscar Wilde and others whom we won't have the opportunity to explore. So, as I said, this is a very long period, and I felt it best to just zero in and allow us a narrow focus rather than trying to encompass the breadth. We simply couldn't do it in a week. The themes I'd like to focus on, I paired them essentially with the authors, but they run through each. In Alfred Lord Tennyson, the narrative point of view of the dramatic monologue is important, and the music of poetry to convey intense emotion. In Robert Browning, again, we're looking at the narrative point of view in the dramatic monologue, but we're also looking at passion and madness and how they you cross over between them. And then in Robert Louis Stevenson, the narrative point of view in Gothic fiction, and this again, what I mean by narrative point of view here is how trustworthy are these narrators who are giving us this tale? And that ties in with the exploration of the duality of human nature, a sort of dark side. So those will be the points I keep returning to. So Tennyson and Browning. In the Norton, you'll notice that in the back, in the appendix, there's a definition of dramatic monologue, and I'll read it. A poem in which the voice of a historical or fictional character speaks, unmediated by any narrator, to an implied, though silent, audience. This became, as they say also in the Norton, a profoundly used style in the Victorian period. The idea of creating a lyric poem in the voice of a speaker ironically distant from the poet is the great achievement of Victorian poetry. And so it's this ironic distance or separation from the poet that we'll look at some in Ulysses and in Porphyria's Lover. Because again, it casts doubt on what is truth, even as these poets felt a strong moral responsibility to uphold a certain truth. Stevenson is going to be interesting to us too in terms of this question of what is true and what is real. And he said to a friend, Sidney Colvin, everything is true, only the opposite is true too. You must believe both equally or be damned. And so what I've done is pose some questions here that to let you know what I'm thinking about in terms of Stevenson's work. So, for example, what does the Jekyll-Hyde split identity suggest about selfhood in the late Victorian era? And how does this model connect to ideas about evolution and human beings' descent from animal forms? Again, you know, this is the time when Charles Darwin's theories are becoming popular and science is questioning all kinds of accepted religious, sort of faith-based realities. And so this exploration of identity, I think, leads us to think about questions of evolution and human consciousness. And then also a question like this, I think, is going to shape our discussions. Is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde a story about the dangers of oppression? What does it tell us about the Victorian convention and double life? And there's a great film I'm going to put a link to that explores a little bit the other side of all of the values that were promoted in Victorian literature and Victorian culture, the values of domesticity and moral rectitude and sort of upright, proper way of being, had a very dark underbelly in this period. And so this idea of double life was present for everyone in society. They knew it was there. They knew it was there because of the increased rate of syphilis and these sorts of things. So finally, I'm trying to suggest that we can look at these authors and understand something about the ambiguity of narrative point of view that emerges in the Victorian period. All three of the writers we discover have unreliable narrators, whether it's because of the genre, which is dramatic monologue, lends itself to that, or because we don't know characters' backgrounds, like Utterson and Jekyll and Hyde, or even Dr. Hyde for that matter. And so again, I pose a few questions for us to think about. And in a time of such stability, England is a stable power at this point. When authors felt a moral responsibility to educate and uplift, why might we encounter such ambiguous narratives? And what does that suggest about what's going on psychically for the culture? What possibilities for alternative narratives exist in all of these works because of the unreliable narrators? In other words, if you asked yourself, what if the tale were narrated differently? How does that sort of lead us to question and explore other possibilities that might be elided or hidden in these tales? And finally, what does the unreliable narrator suggest about Victorian doubt? Because there was a lot of Victorian doubt. Many people felt that this expansion was happening too fast, and there was a lot of doubt. All right, I will see you on the discussion board. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about these readings.